Yokoso owashitare. Welcome back to part 3 of this 4-part series of the story that I can only describe as ancient Japanese true crime meets Cinderella. Again, I keep getting my Disney princesses confused. Anyway, if you have not seen the first 2 videos, I very much recommend you go check those 2 out, because if you don't watch those 2, you're not going to know what's happening here, and I, again, would offer a bit of a recap. However, there's so much, and basically all of it is necessary to understand what's going on, so I'm just going to once again reiterate, please go check out the previous 2 videos if you haven't. And one final thing before we actually get into this story, if you like Japanese history, you like storytelling, please don't forget to like the video, please subscribe to the channel, because part 4 will be coming out in a week if everything goes according to plan and something terrible doesn't happen to me. And because this is in medias res, there is no once upon a time ima wa mukashi, so with all of that out of the way, let's get down to business and continue where we left off. So, while this servant man was busy burying his master's son alive, or maybe sometime immediately after that, but around that same time, this boy's uncle, the younger brother of the Taifunosuke, was hanging out at his house, just kind of chilling, doing whatever he normally does, when he suddenly got this really strong desire to go see his nephew at his older brother's house. And now normally, when a nobleman goes to visit somebody else, he's supposed to send some servants and some messengers on ahead to announce that he is coming, and therefore the people at that house can make ready to receive him properly. However, this uncle's servants were all over the place at the moment, and he didn't want to take the time to round a handful of them up, send them off, and do things the proper way. He just really wanted to see his nephew, whom he treated basically like a son. And so instead of sending off messengers ahead, he instead found one solo guardsman, and he told this guardsman to ready a horse, and then he went inside, put on some travel clothes, got a bow and a quiver full of arrows, because that's just what noblemen did when they traveled in ancient Japan, and together with this single guardsman, they set off down the path to his older brother's house to go see his nephew. Now the thing about this uncle is, although he was technically a nobleman, he was from the countryside. And so, as he was going along the road, and he saw a rabbit jump out of the brush and run across their pathway, he immediately forgot all about wanting to visit his nephew, and taking his bow and readying an arrow, he immediately took off after this rabbit on an impromptu hunt. He was not going to let this quarry escape. Heavens no, the hunt was too tempting. And so, he took off after this rabbit and chased it a good distance. And eventually this rabbit led him into this big grassy field. And now with no tree cover, this uncle took a few shots at this rabbit. Now he was a very exceptionally skilled hunter and archer. And so he was extremely surprised and put out when every single one of his arrows managed to miss this little rabbit, and it escaped into the brush unharmed. And he heaved a sigh in frustration and disappointment, and wondering what the heck happened, how could he have let this rabbit slip through his fingers like that? He was better than this. He simply decided that, well, at the very least, he'd better go pick up his arrows, which were now scattered all over this grassy field. And so, he set his horse walking around this open meadow, looking for his arrows, when all of a sudden he heard a noise that sounded like a dog's howling. And he stopped for a second, he listened, he thought, what the heck? What is that noise? And at first he wondered, oh, maybe it's somebody who's like in the area and is sick and is like suffering or maybe crazy and they're just yelling. But then he looked around and he couldn't find anybody who matched that kind of a description. And so now he was even more perplexed, like, huh? What the heck? And so he sat there and he listened a little bit more. And he noticed that the sound actually sounded muffled, like it was coming from behind something. And then listening even a little bit closer, he surmised that whatever this sound was, it wasn't coming from around him, but rather it was coming from under the ground, of all places. Now right at this point, this uncle's guardsmen, who also went around gathering up the arrows that were fired and had actually picked some of them up and were now bringing them back to this uncle, showed up. And this uncle asked the guardsman, hey, do you hear that howling sound? To which the guardsman responded, I'm not sure what you are referring to, sir. What sound are you talking about? Now at this point, this uncle was still convinced that whatever he was hearing, it was there and he wasn't crazy. So he began having his horse go around this field trying to locate the source of this sound. And his guardsmen dutifully followed behind him, until they happened upon a patch of dirt that looked like it had been disturbed recently, almost like somebody had dug a hole and then hurriedly filled it back up. And it was when they found this hole that the guardsman said, "My lord, I think this is where that sound you were talking about is coming from. I can hear it now, and I think that's where it's coming from." And when this uncle got a little bit closer, sure enough, it definitely sounded like this was the source of this mysterious howling noise. And at first the uncle thought, I wonder if a dead person got buried here and is suddenly back alive and screaming trying to get out. Which, if you know anything about pre-modern history, was actually an occurrence that happened fairly regularly. Somebody would die, except they weren't actually dead, and everybody would think they were dead, and then they would bury them, only for them to wake up underneath the ground in a coffin and suffocate to death. Or, again, that's the origin of the phrase, saved by the bell, because you would attach a bell to that in case they woke up, and then they could ring the bell, and then people would know that you were alive, and they could dig you back out. That's a European tradition, not ancient Japanese, but you get what I'm trying to say. People being buried alive accidentally was a thing that happened. Now, the uncle was wondering if that's what the case was. However, what he told his guardsman was, well, whatever it is, it definitely sounds like it's a human being, so come on, let's dig them out. To which the guardsman kind of took a step back and shook his head and said, "Look, sir, I'm sorry, but this is a little too freaky for me. I don't think I can do this." And the uncle looked at him and said, "Nonsense, come on. If it really is a person and they need help and we can help them survive, this will redound to our good karma. Come on, help me out." And thus saying, this uncle got off of his horse and he grabbed his bow and he went over to this disturbed patch of earth, and because it was still so loose, he began scraping at it with his bow, and with just his bow, he was able to start digging. Now, the guardsman wasn't about to let his lord do all the dirty work, and so dutifully he also went over and began digging at this patch of dirt with his hands. And sure enough, as they kept digging, they could hear whatever was making this sound grow louder and louder. And they both surmised that perhaps because the dirt was so loosely packed together and hadn't been properly filled up if you were trying to actually bury something, that it allowed the sound to escape through it more easily than if it had been packed down properly. And they dug until they came across a little section of plant material, a bunch of branches and leaves and twigs and grasses that made kind of like this lid almost that a lot of this dirt was resting on top of. And when they took all of this plant material and removed it, sure enough, there was a hole there, and at the bottom of this hole was a young boy who was stripped of all his clothing. Now, the uncle, being a good guy, simply said, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. We've got to get him out of there." And he reached down and he pulled this kid out, and then he got a look at him. And he soon realized that this was no random kid. This was his nephew. The very same nephew that he was on his way to go see, the very same nephew that he considered like his own son, that he loved so dearly. And here he was, in a hole. And so, of course, at first, he didn't know what was going on. His brain couldn't quite process what was happening. And his vision went blurry and he was so confused. But when he snapped to, he realized what was happening, and he immediately pulled his nephew in close and he took a look at him, checking him out, making sure that he was okay. And two things he noticed is that one, this kid was showing signs of extreme dehydration. He needed some water. And also, he was cold to the touch everywhere on his body except for right in the center of his chest, where there was only a little bit of warmth left over. And now, in a slight state of panic, the uncle's first thought was, "Holy crap, I have to get him some water." But the problem is they were in the middle of some random field out in the middle of nowhere, and they didn't bring any containers for hydration with them. They weren't planning on going this far. And with no other option, the uncle then turned to his guardsman and simply said, "Go, find water, quickly, hurry." To which the guardsman nodded and immediately ran off to go find some water or do whatever it was he could. And then this uncle took off some of his own clothing, wrapped his nephew up in it, and then held him close to him and hoped that some skin-to-skin contact would actually warm him up a little bit. And then he began praying. He prayed to the gods and the Buddhas that they would save his nephew, that they would let him live. And it was at this point that he also, understandably, began weeping. and he cried and he cried. And the first time he reached up and wiped away some of his tears, he happened to look at his nephew's face, which was almost completely devoid of all color. And also, obviously, at this point, this boy, who was screaming up until just barely, had completely passed out. And now, worried that this kid might actually not make it and that he was on the throes of death and may have already been too far gone, he just held this kid even tighter and began praying even harder, hoping against hope that holding him like this would warm him up and bring him back. And after being like this for a short while, eventually the guardsman came back. Now, he didn't have any containers wherewith to contain water, so instead what he had done is he had pulled out a big cloth and he had found some random stream or pond out there in the mountains, and he had dipped this cloth in that water and soaked up as much of it as he could and then brought that over to the uncle. And this uncle took this cloth and then wrung it out into this kid's mouth, which wasn't exactly the best way to hydrate somebody. However, it's really the only option that they had. Now, when the first bit of water hit this kid's mouth, it kind of fell in and then just dribbled on out. There was no response from him at all. However, he was not discouraged, and praying even harder, he went in and he wrung out a little bit more into this kid's mouth, and he saw the faintest movements in this kid's mouth and in his throat. And it seemed like he was instinctively swallowing what little bit of liquid there was. And now this gave the uncle a little bit of hope, and he continued holding his nephew to him, trying desperately to warm him up as best as he could. And after a little bit of holding him like this, he began to feel some warmth coming back into this little boy's body, and he could feel him coming back. And this time when he looked at the kid's face, he noticed not only that some color had returned, but then this kid's eyes flickered open ever so slightly. They just slightly cracked open. And at this, the uncle was so relieved beyond words, that it very much seemed like his nephew was about to come back. They had almost lost him, but here he was, almost back, but not quite fully yet, because he was still dehydrated. And so, although the uncle was not exactly thrilled about giving his nephew some water from some random mountain, stream, or pond and wringing it out into his mouth using this cloth that his guardsman happened to have on his person, and thought that that was actually kind of disgusting, however, there really wasn't any other option, and he continued hydrating his nephew until eventually he noticed that tears began forming in his nephew's eyes and spilled over. And the uncle took this as a sign that this kid now was hydrated enough that he would be okay. But even though the kid was basically back from the brink of death and likely going to survive, he still was out of it. He was not quite there, even though he was, in a sense, awake. His eyes were open, he was breathing, everything was fine, but he was not particularly responsive to words or any other kind of action. However, it was now getting dark at this moment. And so now this uncle and this guardsman could not afford to stay out here any longer in the hopes that the kid would have some more time to recover. They needed to get him up and out and back to his uncle's house. And so even though it looked like the kid was struggling with it, they managed to get him to sit up okay. Then they brought the horse over, they put him on top of the horse, and together the three of them went back to Uncle's house. Now, by the time they had arrived, it was dark. It was completely dark. And the whole way there, this uncle was sitting there and thinking to himself, how could this have happened? Obviously, it's not like this kid pulled a prank on himself and buried himself. Somebody did this to him. And until he had more answers, he wanted to keep everything as much under wraps as he possibly could. So when they finally arrived back at the house and it was dark, instead of announcing like normal that he was back and everybody should make ready to receive him, he kind of snuck into his own house. And after swearing this guardsman to secrecy to tell nobody, he then took his nephew into one of the offshoot rooms from the main part of the building that he normally lived in, the main part of the house. And there he sat this kid down. Now, because it was in an offshoot of the main part of the house, this uncle's wife was aware that her husband was now home, which was really weird because he didn't announce himself, he didn't immediately come to see her to tell her what was going on, and he was coming back in the wee hours of the evening. Like, normally if you're out this late, you would just stay at wherever it was you were staying. Why are you coming back so late? And so, meaning to ask him all of these questions, she went over into the room that he was in, and right as she was about to say something, she saw that he had their nephew there, which was really weird. This was unconventional. And she said just that. What's going on here? Why do you have the nephew? This is really unusual. What's going on? To which her husband replied, "You have no idea how unusual it's been." And then he began to tell her this story in great detail, in as much detail as he could possibly remember, from the moment that he suddenly was seized upon by the desire to go see his nephew, all the way up until this moment. And having explained everything to his wife, he then turned to this kid and asked him, "Hey son, can you tell me what happened to you?" But the boy was still out of it. He was still kind of staring off into space and not willing to talk to anybody. And so the uncle decided that they were going to leave him be. They were just going to make sure he was taken care of, and when he came back around, they would ask him again. Now, because it was dark, they had some candles lit to make it so that they could actually see a little bit. And they had some food brought to him, which he ate, and then they laid him down and he fell asleep with his uncle and his uncle's wife, so his aunt. So with his uncle and his aunt watching over him. Now, it actually didn't take very long before the kid actually woke up and then sat up and began looking around the room, and he asked, "Where am I? What's going on?" To which the uncle, now seeing that the kid had his wits about him again, explained, "You're at my house, kid, and I have a question. What happened to you?" And the boy, instead of immediately answering, thought for a second and asked, "Where's my dad?" To which the uncle responded, "Your dad doesn't know anything about this yet, and I think he's still at the government headquarters." And then the kid said, "I need to go tell him. I need to go tell him what happened." To which the uncle replied, "I'll tell him for you, but first, I need you to tell me what happened. Who did this to you?" To which the boy replied after a brief silence of thought, "I remember that servant so-and-so came to me and suddenly told me, 'Hey, let's go to your uncle's house.' And after I told my stepmom where I was going, I went with him, but he suddenly went onto a different path and started talking about Yamano Imo, about yams, and he started digging a hole to get them, and then he dropped me in this hole, and that's about all I can remember." And after hearing this story, this uncle sat and thought for a little bit, because he knew who that servant was, and he knew that that servant wasn't particularly bright, and it was very unlike him to concoct a plan like this himself. And he himself really had nothing to gain by doing something so horrible. And believing that this servant man had been put up to this by somebody else, his mind instantly went to the stepmother. And now he began formulating a plan to catch the stepmother in her lying, in the hopes of holding her accountable for this terrible, terrible thing that she had done. And if you want to know exactly how he does that, you're just gonna have to wait for the next video, because this one's probably gonna be plenty long anyway. So, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like the video as well. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that it seems the ancient Japanese had some funny ideas about what happened to you when you're buried alive. And it's a little weird because I looked into it. How do you die technically when you're buried alive? And the most common answer is asphyxiation. You are locked in a small cramped place, you run out of oxygen, and you die from lack of oxygen. Now, when it comes to asphyxiation, I did not see anything about becoming dehydrated or becoming very, very cold. I'm assuming what this story is saying is it just didn't understand what it was that actually got you dead when you were buried alive, not understanding the concept of breathable oxygen. So instead, what they probably believed is that if you were locked underground for a long time, you simply grew cold and all the water seeped out of you by virtue of being surrounded by earth, and that is how you died. So suffice to say, I am pretty sure that this is in fact a folktale, even though it's very, very specific, like there's full-on conversations going on between these people, none of whom are actually directly named, so all signs point to it being a little bit of a hoax, although it could very well be based on an actual true story. It does kind of smack to me of a true crime story that got retold over and over and over again, and some of the details were likely fudged a little bit. But with all of that being said, if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito katajike no koso haberi kere. And again, hopefully we will see you for this next and final video on this story, where we see how the uncle puts his plan into action and brings this mother to justice. Or does he bring her to justice? You're just gonna have to wait and find out. Anyway, once more, thank you sincerely. Have a good one, guys. We'll see you later.